Welcome to The State of Us.
Beyond mainstream cable news and party lines, with a millennial and a boomer, The State of Us pushes past the noise and uncovers all the issues that matter.
Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
I just got an email from Ryan Clancy, the chief strategist of No Labels, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank in Washington, D.C. that's essentially advocating, I guess think tank isn't exactly the correct word, but basically their goal is to advocate Democrats and Republicans working together. And I'm going to share with you the opening to this. Something exceptional and unexpected just happened in Washington, where leaders have been deadlocked over a new COVID-19 relief bill. After weeks of private negotiations, the House problem solvers, with 25 Democrats and 25 Republicans, today released a compromise proposal bridging the divide on the thorniest issues, including aid to small businesses, schools, cities, and states, unemployment benefits, and funding for election security. Now, the email goes on, but what we have in front of us is the attached PDF that explains what these 25 Democrats and 25 Republicans have agreed to. And Ryan Clancy points out that it's no coincidence that Speaker Nancy Pelosi also just announced that the chamber will stay in session until we have a bill that can be supported by both parties. So today, it was just, I think, a week and a half ago, Lance, that we covered, right, the what Congress is looking at doing, what we know about what Republicans want, what Democrats want. Well, this is a follow-up to that, because now we have, here's some Democrats and Republicans, an equal number on both sides of the aisle, that have come together and said, we can work with this. Here's what we can do, right? And it covers most of these areas. So that's what we're going to look at today, break it down, share with you what the quote-unquote compromises are, and tell you if Lance and I are supportive of what's being proposed. But of course, we couldn't begin a conversation on Congress, the Problem Solvers Caucus, and No Labels without
True Chat senior historian and an educator of more than 30 years. Here is your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
Well, you know, the big question, why should you care, is that, first of all, you have Republicans and Democrats coming together to work towards a solution, which is something that I think we all care about right now. I know I've been talking to some friends the last couple of days, and they're just upset because they're tired of the partisanship, and they are Democrats and Republicans. You know, they're on both sides of the aisle, and they're just fed up with the whole system. And this is showing that the system can still work. And then secondly, if you listen to our show and if you've been paying attention this last week in the national media, everybody's saying there's nothing that's going to get done. So here's some hope where some things can get done. And it is true compromise, because basically it doesn't go word for word with the New York Times piece that we did from August that showed both plans, but it takes it to a $2 trillion package. And if you remember, or if you're listening for the first time, the Senate Republican plan was a 1.1 trillion, and the House Democrats plan was a 3.4 trillion. You know, rough math, a $2 trillion deal is both of them coming down about half. At least the people get something, you know? And as we go through this, I think you're going to find out that most of the major items have been covered, and where the difference comes is maybe not just covered as much, but covered to the maximum in other areas, and also lays out something beyond December of 2020, which means there's some pieces in here and some triggers that are in here that can take us into next spring, which I find very interesting.
You pointed that out. You were doing the math right before the show, and then we got sidetracked on it's fall and it's chilly and it's time to make chili and all of that. But right before we got into that, Lance, you were telling me that, you know, the rough math equals out that, hey, this is in between, right? And that's the nature, folks, right, of compromise. I mean, I think as we go through this, as I was looking through it, for what it's worth, there's a couple things that weren't really addressed in what we talked about a couple weeks ago that I'm glad I see in here. They're not huge things, but I was just noticing them. So as we walk through it, see if you all pick up on it. I'll try to highlight them when we get to them. But I think that's part of what's encouraging behind this is exactly what Lance and I were getting upset with at the end of that episode is, hey, Congress needs to get off their butt, do their jobs, and help the American people. And here we go. We got, right, it's thanks to Lance and I, because we told them to do it, and here they are.
Sounds good to me. I like it. I mean, I hope they're listening to the show. I don't think they are. We've got a few listeners in Washington, D.C. area, but, maybe some people are listening, but, the world would be a better place if more people did listen. But that's for the end. That's for the end of the show.
I mean, you can tell them now.
We're talking about this because we try to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And a couple of weeks ago, we were trying to be respectful and tell Congress to get off your butt and quit worrying about whether it's the Democrats' plan or the Republican plan. Do something for the well-being of the American people, of the American businessman and the American worker, all of them, not just businessmen, but businesswomen as well. That we just need something to help us out, folks. The country's struggling and we need some help, and we're looking to you, and get rid of your partisan bickering and do something for us. That's why we elected you.
And that's exactly what a few people in Congress, 50 of our congressmen and women, are doing right now with this framework. So let's get into it, Lance. The first thing, and by the way, I just want to note this, please, as we're going through, pay attention to the order. I don't know, because I have not had the opportunity to speak to Ryan about this directly, the chief strategist at No Labels. I'm not sure if there's a significance or not to the order that this is presented in, but as I was kind of looking through it, Lance, I have the feeling that it's intentional the way this is laid out, where I think with the article that we were looking at the other day, there was no particular, they were just covering it, right? That's not the case. They've laid this out. This is a PDF from them. And so just pay attention as we're going through this to the order.
And it's connected, right? So if you want to get on there and follow along with us, it's connected.
Thestateofus.org, right, Lance, our website.
Yep.
You head over there and you can open it for yourself. It really is. This is one of the better ones in terms of it's very brief. We've got bulleted things on each page, so it's real easy to look at if you want to follow.
Unless you're driving down the road, and then unless you're in one of Devin's most favorite things, and that's a driverless car, then I guess you do have that option of reaching over and opening that up.
Lance never going to be in one of those. So the way they lay this out, Lance, is problem, solution, right? Problem solvers caucus.
And it's very typical of No Labels. If you've been a listener of the show for a few years, you know that this is the way No Labels presents all of their things. Here's the question, here's the problem, here's the solution. Because, and we've got people on board in Congress who say this is the solution on both sides of the aisle. That's the whole premise, right?
Yeah, this isn't theoretical. This is what the Problem Solvers Caucus themselves, those 50 Congress people, have released. So first up, the problem, testing and healthcare. The COVID-19 virus continues to spread through the country, reducing transmission through rapid and reliable testing and tracing, and ensuring quality treatment for all those affected must be our foremost priority. The solution, Lance, $25 billion for testing and contact tracing, $30 billion for healthcare provider support, and $45 billion forgiveness of Medicare loans to providers.
So that we're not reducing the Medicare trust fund, which, if you're getting into the weeds of what's been talked about, that's one of the concerns, that Medicare's could be running out of money. And this is to stop that from happening.
And so this is, again, one of those kind of middle of the road ones. It is more specific than I think what we got to talk about in the past on healthcare, as far as how much for testing and contact tracing and so forth. It seems like this should be something, again, both sides had already indicated an interest, right, in doing this. So this is where you're coming together and saying, okay, here's what we're actually going to do.
Yep.
And as far as it stacks up, $25 billion for testing and contact tracing. The Republican plan originally called for $16 billion, and the Democrat plan $75 billion. So this is definitely leaning toward the Republican side in terms of the testing component, but the Democrats did gain some ground on healthcare provider support and forgiveness of Medicare loans.
And again, it's just an example of compromise. That's
right.
I mean, the long and short of it, don't get lost in the numbers, even though they are important. The bottom line is it's a compromise. So you get a little here, you take a little from this, and that's what you come up with.
So tell us the next one, Lance. Support for individuals and families, right? $316 billion. What's the problem?
This is the one that'll catch everybody's attention because it's talking about stimulus money. But the problem, according to the problem solvers, because of COVID-19, fixed costs for individuals and families are often exceeding the ability to pay for food, rent, loans, and other necessities. And if you've had your TV on or your radio on at all, you know that the anecdotal evidence is large for this, this is a fact. And the solution, 15% in WIC plus up through March 2021 at a cost of $1 billion. 15% SNAP plus up through July of 2021. Notice the dates. They're going past January of 2020, like I had talked about in the opening, for a cost of $10 billion. And the one that'll make people stand up and probably pay attention, $1,200 direct stimulus checks plus $500 per child, plus a dependent adult retroactive $280 billion. So all three of those things total $280 billion, but it's a $1,200, a second round of stimulus checks at the same level as were received before. Rental assistance for the most needy and rent stabilization programs, and or an eviction moratorium through January 2021, $25 billion, and student loan forbearance through December 31st, 2020. So the stimulus checks are there, not only paid for a child, but also some retroactive that if you take care of a dependent adult, as I'm sure stipulated on your tax returns, there's money for that. Rental assistance, help for the people who are the neediest with WIC and SNAP, and even saying student loan going through the end of the year. So a pretty broad-based support.
Again, like Lance pointed out, this is stuff, right, that was being discussed that we had talked about last time. And I see wins for both here. The dates spoke to me too, Lance, because this is something you and I talked about at the end of the last episode we did on this that I think is so critical for people to keep in mind as we go forward into the second segment. It's not so much in a lot of areas. It was not that Democrats and Republicans didn't agree that something needed to be done. It wasn't even really a disagreement a lot of times about quote unquote how much should be done. It was a disagreement about how long things should be done for, because
right.
When you look at the money that Republicans were proposing, right, it was in line with similar monies that Democrats were proposing. The reason the Democrat proposal was more expensive was mainly because it covered a longer period of time where the Republicans did not. And the thing that I really noticed with this one, Lance, is that compromise on dates, right? You've got SNAP, your supplemental nutrition assistance program, like food stamps essentially, right, that go through July of 2021, which is something the Democrats really wanted. On the other hand, student loan forbearance only goes through December 31st of 2020 right now. That's more in line with what the Republicans wanted. And then WIC is kind of that, and for those that don't know, by the way, WIC is Women, Infants, and Children Assistance for those that are protecting the health of those individuals who are in a low income bracket. And that goes through March, which is kind of that center of the road, right? So they each got one of what they wanted, and then on one, they both gave ground. The Democrats don't get it as long as they'd like. The Republicans are doing it longer than they wanted. So again, that's the nature of compromise. And what we're going to look at coming up is unemployment assistance, along with small business and nonprofit aid, schools, childcare, state and local aid, election aid, and more. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
25 Democrats and 25 Republicans. They make up the Problem Solvers Caucus in Congress, and they released just recently a compromise proposal that bridges the divide on the thorniest issues, and that includes things like aid to small businesses, schools, cities, and states, unemployment benefits, and funding for election results. We've already looked at a few of those things, including that possibility of direct stimulus checks, Lance, right? Which seems like it's probably going to happen. I mean, it's almost certain it's going to be part of that next bill. This next one, too, is something that a lot of people have been interested in. These next two are really of a lot of interest to me. Unemployment assistance for $120 billion, Lance. The problem, right? COVID-19 has caused significant damage to the U.S. and world economy, resulting in layoffs, furloughs, and an impediment to returning to work. Americans who've been displaced from their jobs due to COVID-19 need federal support to pay their bills and put food on the table for their families until they can get back to work. It's important to provide such support without a corresponding economic incentive to remain unemployed. And this part, Lance, the solution, I really like this because this is one of the things that was upsetting me with the proposals on both sides previously.
The Republican, and correct me if I'm wrong, the Republican solution was $200 a week, and the Democrats wanted to reinstate the $600 a week.
Correct.
So that was what was out there from the Senate Republicans and the House Democrats.
So they're coming up with, Lance, $450 a week for an 8-week transition period. It is then followed up by up to, and this is really key, up to $600 a week. So this is one of the things before, Lance, that I thought was a fault with both plans, right? Both of them were this boilerplate. This is just what you get, right? You just get this. You get that extra 600 or you get that extra 200 and that's that. And that's how it is. This part here, followed by up to 600 a week and up to, but not to exceed 100% of previous wages. The reason this is so important is because of that last sentence, Lance, right? Which is you want to provide support, but you do not want to provide an incentive to remain unemployed. And if people get more money from unemployment than they did at the job they had, they're not likely to, basic logic, right? You're going to take advantage of that as long as you can and then go back to work once you can't take advantage of it.
Honestly, I believe that most of us do want to work, that we don't want to sit around. But what it does is it takes away one of the complaints that the conservatives had, that
Yes.
Not only are we paying somebody, but we're paying them, they're getting more for sitting at home than they were going to work. So I think that was a complaint that we heard a lot around here in our more conservative area of the country where we live. So, and it's interesting, it's phased in, right? It's over a 13-week period. It would run, obviously they're saying it's going to pass sooner rather than later, from mid-October through January of 2021. So you've got the 450 for 8 week, and then you can get up to 600 if you were making $600 a week. But if you weren't, if you're only making 550 a week, then you're going to get 550, which is still an increase, and we're still talking about folks in most places, that's hardly a livable wage, but it is better than nothing. And it's a lot better than the 200.
Right. It addresses both concerns and it does allow people to get up to the 600, but they do have to, it has to be in line with what they were previously making as opposed to just getting it. And that is like what Lance said, I think part of what makes it easier for the Republicans to say, yeah, okay, we'll do that because they feel like that's a more reasonable approach to the situation as opposed to just, again, handing over the money.
Right. And if you were making 700 a week, you're only going to get 600. So
Right.
You're still not getting everything that you were making. So it's, like you said, compromise, right? That's the theme of the show.
So the next one, Lance, as much as I want to read this one, I'll let you take it. I don't want to be too skewed here. So, but I'm still going to tell people what I think.
I'll read it quickly because I know this is more up your alley. The small business and nonprofits, $290 billion total. The problem, most small businesses who receive PPP loans have exhausted those resources, and many of them and their millions of employees are hanging in the balance. And again, if you open up the newspaper or turn on the TV or look at your phone, you're hearing every day more and more small businesses having to close or lay off more workers. Furthermore, many small businesses in distressed communities and owned by entrepreneurs of color were unable to obtain loans through the original program. So they're noticing that the problem's there and not everybody got it that needed it. The solution, $240 billion for PPP, a second loan, $145 billion remaining from PPP to be reappropriated. $95 million in new money.
$95 billion, right?
$50 billion for targeted employee retention credit and rectify the Main Street lending program. Justin, I'll let you interpret that for everybody. being as you are the head of a small business.
So I think the importance of, and don't let Lance downplay it, right? He's an owner of a small business as well, but but yes, $240 billion for PPP. So this is really, again, a second round. And just for full disclosure, we've already told people this on the air, but if you're a new listener, TrueChat, the company that is responsible for the State of Us, the program you're listening to, hosts a number of programs and did utilize the PPP program. So very familiar with it on a firsthand experience basis. Once it became available, the process was pretty straightforward. It's the whole becoming available part of it that that was the struggle, I think, for many. So the idea, second round, I think is, I think there's a lot of small businesses out there that are going to look at that and say, yeah, we really got to have that.
It's pretty much a big win on the Democratic side. The Republicans had kind of offered about $200 billion in small business aid, 90 of it in paycheck protection and PPP. And the Democrats had said almost 350.
Right.
200 to 350, I guess, is more of a straight up compromise.
Yep.
200 to 350 and it's 290. So, but it's, again, as you pointed out in your opening, it's much more specified as to where it's going. It's not just, hey, here's a bunch of money, we're going to throw it, see what sticks to the wall. It's specified in different areas.
Like the $95 billion, Lance, in new money, because this is important, right? Not all of the Paycheck Protection Program was utilized. They passed all this money in part because of the confusion around forgiveness. And we are just now receiving guidance, by the way, from the bank, Lance, that, TrueChat went through. We're just now getting that guidance on what the forgiveness process is. And that was part of what scared me. I mean, right, as a business owner, you typically don't enter into like a loan agreement without knowing all the details. And basically the government was asking us to just trust them that they would figure out the forgiveness portion. Now they have figured it out, right? They did come through on that. We're finally getting that. But this time up front, that's part of why some of that money wasn't taken, is you had a lot of people that qualified for it that didn't want to take it because they're like, if I don't know how I'm going to, if I'm going to qualify for forgiveness, I'm not doing this because I don't want to get stuck owing this money back. Now, granted, it's only at like, I think 1 or 2% interest or something. So, I mean, it's still a really good loan, even if it's a loan. But for many, it was that we're not expecting to pay this back. And so this time, the transparency about forgiveness, simplified forgiveness, all of that's going to make it easier, I think, for that $145 billion that was sitting there to be reappropriated and hopefully get used this time for those people that need it. And the new money is broken down into smaller pots, Lance, right? Where, and I won't go into all of them, but money for banks, money for the economic insurance disaster loan program. All of that's specified in this one where it was not yet before. And I'm sure that's part of what let Democrats and Republicans come to the agreement, is getting some of that hammered out.
Well, and the Democrats, in total transparency, did not want to reestablish the PPP program. They had, $300 billion in small business loans, but they weren't going to use the PPP program for some of the problems that you talked about. So this keeps that program going. So that's another part of the compromise.
It's almost like this was planned, Lance. I had you read the small business and nonprofits one, and now I get to read the schools and childcare one.
There you go.
$145 billion for schools and childcare. The problem: all schools, colleges, and universities, whether reopening or conducting remote or hybrid learning, are in need of resources to protect the health of students, teachers, staff, and visitors to ensure access to the equipment necessary for effective learning. I summed this one up, Lance, that problem. I was just thinking about Urbana-City schools, right? You were telling me about, and you're actually participating in this new online course program that they purchased, because they're doing a hybrid where if people wanted to go online from home, they could, or they could come back in person. Well, they had to purchase a new program, right? I mean, they're having to spend money in ways that they had not planned to spend money. And regardless of whether you're in a school district that's really well off or not, that's money you weren't planning on spending that you've all of a sudden had to outlay. So what they're looking at as a solution: $15 billion for child care providers, flexible and immediate. So that's $10 billion for provider relief and $5 billion for child care development block grants. And then the biggest chunk is $100 billion, Lance, for your K through 12 schools for virtual, hybrid, and or in-person learning. So this is basically, right, let's get monies out to those schools to help them cover these costs that they've, in many cases, right, they've already taken on. They've already paid for this stuff, and now they're trying to figure out where they're going to make that up. And then $30 billion for higher education institutions. But the bulk of the money, Lance, clearly, right, going through K through 12.
The money is about evenly split, but it's going to the areas that the Democrats wanted. The Republicans had other areas that are covered in some of these other places. But this is basically saying, yes, the schools need help. And like everything else in this program, this plan that's laid out, it's probably not enough to take care of everything, but it will alleviate some of the pressure to let us survive till we can get to the other side and then start the process of the belt tightening and paying down things once things level out here with the pandemic.
Up next, we're going to talk about state and local aid. This was a big area that we had discussed before where Republicans and Democrats were pretty far apart. We'll also look at election aid. This is kind of, I don't want to say it's a new one because Lance and I did discuss it, but it's one of the main tenets of this, as well as broadband, agriculture, United States Postal Service, and census. This was some of the miscellaneous topics that Lance and I felt were really important as well. And we'll look at all that, including boosters and reducers. This is something that Lance and I were harping about on the last one, or at least I was. I don't know if Lance was, but I said, I think what they should do is reach a compromise and have provisions in place that either automatically increase or reduce funding based on certain markers or milestones as time goes on. And guess what? They're proposing that. I'm not taking credit for it, folks. The negotiations have been in progress for weeks. So as I was saying that, they were probably negotiating on it. I'm just really glad to see it here. And we're going to break it down for you. Keep it here on The State of Us. And we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Our leaders in Washington have been deadlocked over a new COVID-19 relief bill for weeks, but private negotiations were underway with the House Problem Solvers Caucus. That's 25 Republicans, 25 Democrats in the House of Representatives, and they've released a framework and a compromise set of solutions. We're looking at state and local aid now, $500.3 billion. The problem here, pretty straightforward. State and local governments have been severely impacted by COVID-19. The solution: allow $130 billion remaining from the CARES Act for flexible use on documented past state and local COVID expenses, $130 billion in new money, $120 billion in new money for documented local general revenue shortfalls, $250 billion in new money for documented state general revenue shortfalls.
Right. It's about half of what the Democrats were asking for. It may be enough. It may not be enough to cover everything, but notice too, it also says to cover past and future expenses as well as shortfalls through 2021. So here's some money to get you through. And then afterwards, you need to locally, which is always the best way to go. You need to locally or in your state figure out what's best for your people to solve the money crunch.
And this is, again, pretty much a down the middle compromise here in terms of total dollars, because the Democrats were proposing a little over $1 trillion, almost 1.1 trillion, for their aid to local government, right? And the Republicans were proposing like $100 billion or so, and they've arrived at that $500.3 billion. This also includes, just before we move on, Lance, I wanted to point out the tribal and territorial government allocations. So these are both your Indian reservations and territories of the United States, which weren't exactly completely overlooked in the first round, but they definitely were not given the sort of attention they should have received. Election aid, $400 million, Lance.
I like this because we're hearing all of this talk about, having an open and fair election. And obviously with COVID, different states are handling it differently. But as it states here, the problem, we need to conduct a safe, secure, and efficient election as possible. We need poll workers, which is tough here in Ohio. They're having place to find temporary staffing, polling location PPE, and communications about where and how to vote. And it's just straightforward. Given $400 million to the states to help in election costs. And folks, if there's nothing that's more important, this is right up there with, after you keep folks alive, we have to have a free and open election. And everybody needs to have the opportunity to vote without risking their life.
Completely agree with you, Lance. And I'm glad that it was one of the main tenets that they included here, because it's definitely the least amount of money overall, right? I mean, in terms of main points of this proposal, it's only $400 million. It's definitely needed. I'm glad it's in there. I think hopefully we're all glad that it's in there, because you want free and fair elections. The next one, broadband, agriculture, USPS, United States Postal Service, and census, a total of $52 billion. $12 billion, Lance, for broadband hotspots in underserved communities.
One of the problems is people, when we went, this spring, people didn't have Wi-Fi services, or they didn't have access to it.
Right.
And so this takes care of that. I mean, it doesn't take care of it, but it at least addresses that concern.
Well, and obviously for kids, right, online school, but also for workers. Because if you're in those same communities, sure, if you've now over doubled your internet usage, right, your kids at home and you're at home working at home, you may just not have even the best service you can buy might not be adequate, right?
Right.
I mean,
right.
I know people around here that's the case for, Lance, that you can't buy good enough service. $25 billion for agriculture. That not surprising at all here, Lance, because this, if you recall, this is an area they were both pretty close on anyway. Mm-hmm. So I mean, this just makes
pretty
sense.
Right.
$15 billion for USPS. And the second part's the part that I really love, because we were going to do an episode on this. Elimination of the full pre-funding requirement. For those of you that don't know what this is why the United States Postal Service is always having to ask Congress for more money. There is a law from 40 or 50 years ago that requires that every time the United States Postal Service hires a new employee, that they be setting aside the full amount required for that employee's retirement as long as the employee works there. This is insane. That no other business anywhere in the entire world has ever operated this model. And while, yes, you want to protect the retirement of workers, many USPS employees don't even stay long enough to qualify for retirement. So this has always handicapped the Postal Service and their ability to ever have a balanced budget. If you just eliminate the pre-funding requirement, they would have a balanced budget.
I totally agree. I think it just makes total sense. And when you brought that up, it's like, well, duh, why is that? And like you said, you want to protect workers, but you're funding people who many of them don't even retire from the post office.
Right. So, you're setting aside all that money, and it just sits there.
And that's why you have the cost overruns and the shortages. So, and why do they have to operate differently than every other business in the United States?
The United States government has a long history, right, Lance, of delivering retirement to its workers as promised. So I don't know why the post office has to be the one agency that's got to do it different than everybody else. That it just doesn't seem, appropriate. So we got to move on, though. Modify statutes, right, to allow extension of census and an accurate count. Again, obviously COVID has hindered the ability of the Census Bureau to conduct an accurate account. Like Lance said, next to the elections, probably the next most important thing is that we have an accurate accounting of how many people live in different places so that our representatives can be, apportioned correctly to the different areas.
The worker and liability protections, there's no money here, but the problem, obviously, COVID-19 has created the need to ensure workers, customers, and students are protected from transmission, and businesses, schools, and institutions are protected from frivolous lawsuits. The solutions just enhance protections for entities which followed enhanced OSHA guidelines and robust enforcement of workers' safety. So it's just mostly lip service, putting laws in place, rules in place, at least recognizing the importance of the safety and health of workers during the pandemic, but there's no money attached to it. And then last but not least, Justin, the automatic boosters and reducers. We don't want to end the show without talking about this because, as you said, it's something that you called for, and it is a very interesting setup, what they have listed here.
Yes, I think everything here is great that they've reached all these compromises, but to me, this was the key, because what I don't want, Lance, right, is for us to get a few months down the road and be in this same damn situation again where Congress is gridlocked and I can't agree on what to do, and all that crap. Because I'm sorry, that's what it is, right? It's garbage. It's absolute crap that we are paying our Congress people and that they can't get something done for us when this is literally like one of the most important times to do something for the American people, and you're wasting time, yakking back and forth. So I'm really glad this is in here.
But, on the flip side, it's reducers. So if this problem goes away or we get a vaccine quicker than we think we will, it's got rules in there to reduce spending as well.
Correct.
So that's the big thing is they've taken care of both sides. It's not, it's going to be so bad. And so we got to have something planned for 6 months down the road because, it's going to keep going on. It also addresses, if it does go down, if we do get everything under control as we're being told we are, whether you believe it or not, if it is happening, then there are things in place to reduce the spending. So it covers it both ways. When people say, well, we just really don't know what's going to happen in the future. Okay. This part of it takes care of it. If it gets worse, this is going to kick in. If things get better, then this kicks in and we'll start saving some money.
Exactly. And that's what's great about it, because it does what Lance and I keep calling for: depoliticize it, right? Depoliticize it. We don't know what's going to happen. And anybody that tells you that they do is crazy. We don't know. It may get much worse. It may stay about the same. It may get better, right? And we don't know how long or when that's going to happen. So this is great because it says, here's what happens in both situations. $400 billion available in boosters. That includes, Lance, automatic stimulus checks in March of 2021, if warranted, based on metrics. Another $280 billion headed out in automatic stimulus checks. Those are your, direct checks to Americans. The reducers, you could save as much as $200 billion, reduction of Paycheck Protection Program if unnecessary, state and local reduction if unnecessary, and rental assistance reduction if unnecessary. Again, both of these are based on COVID hospitalization metrics and vaccine progress. That's what they're both based on. So whether it goes up, whether it goes down, the boosters, the reducers, they're there. Lance, we've had this conversation today. You already told people about the mission, right? But if they want to further that mission, if they want to help others understand the importance of compromise like this and getting Congress to do something, how can they spread the word about listening to The State of Us as a podcast? Well,
I'm going to put my stamp of approval on this because it's not a Republican plan. It's not a Democratic plan. To me, it's a plan for the American people. And so I'm for this, and hopefully it gets passed sooner rather than later. But the important thing is, folks, share this with your friends, see how they feel. We can all contact our Congress people, put some pressure on them to get something done. You can find us on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and everywhere podcasts are found.
It's got my stamp of approval as well, Lance. And if you're sharing this episode with your friends, that definitely gets two stamps of approval: gold star, gold sticker, stamps, stars, stickers, the whole 9 yards. By the way, right, important to mention, Lance, podcast and syndicated radio program. And that's why we always tell people this, because if you're listening on the radio, you can listen to it as a podcast or vice versa. Tuesdays and Thursdays by 4 a.m. Eastern time, you can listen to the podcast version, and find us on the weekends. Tune in to your local talk affiliate radio station. And if we're not there, tell them you'd like them to carry The State of Us. You can always follow along at thestateofus.org. We've got it all linked there. Be sure to check it out. Also, contactingcongress.org if you want to know, like Lance was talking about, I don't know how to contact my congressperson. Hey, that's okay. There's a website for that. For The State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
And I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to our recording producer, Devin McCain, editing producer, Bradley Butch. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.